Requesting Ms. Nivedita to please switch off her microphone. Thank you. Our speaker for today, Ms. Aditi Kaul, is a leading art-based therapist and psychologist. And to tell us more about her, I now hand over to Ms. Vaidhayi Naik.
Hello everyone, glad to see you all here. Today we have with us Ma'am Aditi Kaul. She is program head in art-based therapy. She is a psychotherapist at Department of Mental Health and Behavioral Sciences at Fortis Mental Health Care. She has 8 years of experience in the field of mental health. She pursued her master's in psychology from Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai, Grade 5 UNESCO and certified dance woman therapist and professional art therapist affiliated to Canadian International Institute of Art Therapy. She has run the program Span Forties for last 7 years, which includes working with people having anxiety, trauma, depressive disorders of childhood using psychotherapeutic techniques including visual arts, movements, writing, storytelling. She has done many preventive mental health workshops with schools, colleges, NGOs across the cities, and she has been teaching expressive arts in clinical practice course for last 6 years in collaboration with UNESCO and the Council. So ma'am, we are honored to have you here and we all welcome you and looking forward to learn a lot from you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaidhayi.
Am I supposed to start or no?
Yes.
Okay, 1 second. I'm just trying to figure out. Okay, so what I will actually ask the 64 of you who are here today to do is, if anyone does have a question in the middle, I'd like you to actually pause me. You can put it on chat. You can also turn on your video and your audio and ask me, because I'd rather have face to face. I think, I keep thinking about how all the teachers across schools and universities are teaching with a faceless group, and it must be so difficult because the lack of interaction is problematic. So whenever you guys feel like you have a question, flag it. I'm not so used to Google Meet, so I don't know if you can raise hand, etc., like you can in Zoom. But otherwise, you can type it out on chat. And if you want, you can put on your video. And I think you guys are tech savvy enough to you can turn it off and on, right? Okay. To start with, I'm actually going to ask you guys a question. And again, start off by posting on chat. So what is your sense of art-based therapy? What have you heard? What do you think? What would you like to know? Any of the 3 questions I'd like you to kind of start with, because I'm not going to do it in a PPT format. I'd rather tailor the workshop and also explain a little bit about where art therapy helps. I will perhaps present a PPT where I'll show you a case of what we've been doing digitally in art therapy. So while, when you hear of art therapy, you also realize that we obviously use different kinds of art media, movement, writing, storytelling. There's a whole umbrella that comes into it. But I think one of the things we've been doing digitally is actually doing art therapy sessions online, which is really cool. And I think it's also breaking new ground around how we think of therapy. All these years we've been taught the therapy happens in a certain structure, in a certain format. We need to be in person. And I think perhaps the one thing this whole time has taught us is that it's not necessary. That it would be ideal, but it's not necessary. You can actually reach out to far more people, even through group-based interventions, utilizing even something like art-based therapy, which requires sort of holding and tangibility. So let's get started. I don't know if I'm looking at the right space, but can you all start posting thoughts or questions around what you think art therapy is, or what would you like to know? You logged on at 5 o'clock or 5:20 or whatever it is in the evening to hear me out. So tell me what you want to know. Okay, we have Vipasha says, I think even scribbling with colored pencils can be a part of art therapy because it helps in releasing stress. I don't know if I'm correct. Yes, and that will bring me to the first distinction. How different art therapy can be virtually. I'm going to get to that for sure. And expressing yourself through art. Okay, So let me start off with the first couple of comments, and you guys can keep going as and when you think of something. Is yes, there are two kinds of art therapy, right? I mean, when you understand art therapy, we actually study it in a triangular form, which is art as therapy and art-based psychotherapy. Right? So art as therapy is what Vipasha has written, which is that any art form, whether it starts with visual art, which means scribbling, coloring, drawing, painting, collaging, looking at movement, dance, theatre, playing with sand, playing with clay, music, both music we listen to or music we create, are all therapeutic in their own right, correct? So a lot of us, if I had you in front of me, I would ask you to raise your hand and tell me that, how many of us have ever, and you can write yes or give a thumbs up if that's possible. How many of you have ever written in a journal or written a poem when you're feeling a certain way, good or bad? Or watched a TV show which you know will make you cry, but you need that, so you watch it anyway? Or drawn something based on how you feel, good, bad, difficult, to reflect on that, or listen to a certain playlist because you're feeling a certain way, right? So, and I can see the knees and the hands up coming in. So that component is basically the art form itself is therapy, right? So art as therapy. The second piece of it is art-based psychotherapy, which is now where does the science come, right? So art psychotherapy is a combination of three things. One is art, the field of art itself. And again, when I say art, don't think of drawing only. I'm talking about visual art, I'm talking about movement, I'm talking about writing, I'm talking about a whole bunch of stuff. Where does art meet psychology, meet neuroscience, right? So that's the new backing. There's a lot of neuroscientific evidence behind why art therapy is so effective. When we look at where art therapy is effective, predominantly, it works in a couple of areas, not just with children. So that's, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions that, art therapy, bachcho ke liye. It's basically for kids. And, that comes to us very naturally because kids are more drawn to art, they are less defensive. And parents also find it sensible that children and art make sense. But if an adult walks in and says, I'm struggling, and you say, art therapy, there's always a barrier, right? Because as we grow older, we start developing more and more and more defenses in our lives, and aise nahi kar sakte, we can't do this, we can't talk like this, we can't sit like this, so on and so forth. So the more defenses that build up, the more language we use. So verbally, we're all quite adept, right? Because when we started talking, that talking pattern was consistently reinforced in our lives through school, through college. You'll write essays, you'll keep writing, you'll keep talking, public speaking, so on and so forth. But to do art in any form kind of strips you of a lot of layers of defenses, which is why typically we feel adults feel a little bit more threatened by artwork. And I'll give you a really funny example of a school workshop that I had actually done. But let me gather my thoughts. I'm very scatterbrained that way. Hold on. I'm going back to your comments. Samir says, I understand the use of art as a projective technique to understand the client, but how to use it for psychotherapy to heal? Can we use it as a standalone therapy to heal? So Samir, yes and no. Depends on what the person is struggling with, right? So like any other form of therapy for all those budding psychologists, doesn't matter what field you pick up, you can never be the standalone intervention for anyone as a standard. That, this CBT works for everybody or art therapy works for everybody, right? You need to understand where science or evidence shows the most research, right? So for example, if someone comes in with OCD, then ERP, which is exposure response prevention, cognitive behavior work, will be the most effective. Art therapy doesn't hold much value there. Art therapy can become an adjunct form of therapy depending on if the person needs it at all. Right? And again, a combination of pharmacotherapy perhaps would be beneficial there as well. Now, if I look at trauma work, when I look at trauma work, there is a very strong chain of evidence around art-based therapy. Now, there are different kinds of art-based therapy. So what intervention do I use there? So, for example, cognitive art-based therapy versus psychoanalytic or dynamically informed art therapy, humanistic trauma-informed art therapy. So even within art therapy, there are various channels of how one can conceptualize a case, how one can form or create an intervention, right? Would I use a narrative approach? So, for example, I've been working, and I'll perhaps show you a couple of slides with this young boy. Let me show you. I think it was just open on my desktop. Okay. I'm going to try and present and see if it opens up. Just give me a thumbs up if it does. So, 1 second. So I think if I can show you while I talk, it might give you a stronger sense of clarity. Okay, so this is an example of just give me a thumbs up if you can see the PPT, but how will I see if you can see it? Okay, can anyone tell me if you can see the PPT, please? Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so essentially, I'll show you a couple of slides. Now, this is a boy who's 10 years old, who we actually, through the course of therapy, it was a year in therapy that he came in for, and we actually looked at grief work. He lost his father, I think a couple of months before he came into therapy. Extremely bright child, with struggling with grief, struggling with the trauma of having found this person, found his father when his father had actually passed away. He was the first one to step in and see him. So that's a lot for an 9-year-old to handle at that point, right? He became 10 years old as he went through the therapeutic process. And what happened through the process was basically the creation of a comic strip, right? And they're just snippets that I'll show you. This is the initial phase in therapy where we did an intake and he began creating this comic. And I said, okay, what if, and this is now the assessment phase in art-based therapy, right? Where a lot of the artwork we did was around, okay, if this is the character he's brought into session, which was called Toby, then I would say, okay, can we draw Toby in school? So this was Toby in school, or Toby at home, or where's Toby's family, and who are the family members? And it grew to, after multiple sessions, a space where Toby had an army, and then there was, if you can look on the other side, it says Chromium's army, and now Chromium is the bad guy, right? So he developed, or we together developed this narrative that came through therapy, which started out about this central character where he was projecting. So, someone talked, Samir, I think you talked about projective tests, but art as a projective medium becomes a space to break through a lot of the defenses you're holding. Now, this is a child who was unable to concentrate, was having difficulty in school at this point, was not talking about his loss, who would completely shut down, had developed extreme fears around being able to communicate, being able to sleep alone, being able to play alone, being able to be in a room alone, which didn't exist before this. And not talking about it, not verbalizing it, not being able to release it. And later, through the artwork and the story, we came to a point where we realized that it was also a space that he was struggling to sort of feel like he was the caretaker for the parent. And, how could he sort of move forward if he was taking care of the mother, right? How could he verbalize it? What if she felt bad? How would she feel? And it's not something that was always a conscious process. So I'm going to move, let me show you. So this was all character development. And again, when conversations around characters happen, then, there we have Toby and Goa also. This was interesting. So we also saw that when, for the first time after that grief period, that him and his mom went for a vacation, which was really scary and big for both of them. The vacation was drawn out, and if you can see, these are some of the key characters. And later we kind of discovered through his interpretation and his sharing over time, I think about 6-8 months into therapy, that this character here, someone he called Volcan, was actually a representation of a father, who was this figure, who was sturdy, who was important, who was creating support, but who was always somewhere off to the side. And Abhi, you see, he's taken him on holiday. But there's also this little black, I don't know if you can see my cursor, tornado in the bushes on the right-hand side, which is something called Doom from Chromium's army, which was one of the big bad guys and which was almost like a representation of death following them around. And now this, we didn't know that. This is stuff that came up, verbalization and writing, in when the comic strip developed later. If you can see, we had a written comic that paralleled all the artwork as we processed. I'm just going to breeze through it a little bit. But this story was about this character who goes through a lot of different kinds of struggle, right? Each strip was about this character, Toby, struggling, um, Volcan supporting the character but not being able to be there in the actual fight, Toby having to go off with this little bird who was his friend to actually fight the bad guys and then build this other army of support systems that he needed. So what we did was, as I pushed him forward through the comic, a lot of the dialogue, a lot of what I discussed with him was solution focused, was cognitive. So when we're talking art-based therapy, it's not just draw what you want, right? It's layered. So initially was the intervention phase where it was a lot around the directives about creating, but creating about the family, creating about the school, creating about all these pieces of his life, where we discovered interpersonal relationships. We also had sessions where mom and child worked together. So I could see patterns emerging which they might have otherwise described to me. When you describe a pattern, when you see it happening, it's a whole other world. And you can also reflect on patterns and alter relationships, and that's a whole other story of how family therapy in art therapy works. So I think I'll pause, but there's a lot, right? There's different layers. We did different kinds. He explored the same colors that he used for his characters to do glass painting. So there was this whole sort of space that built. And actually, the breakthrough in therapy was 2 months ago when he decided that now we're going to switch comics. Sorry, I don't know if you can. Are you back to me now? I think we're back to me. Okay. So I think the breakthrough in therapy was when he felt that the comic strip got a decent end. It hadn't closed. That Volcan was where he needed to be. That Toby and this parrot and their army lost some people, won some battles, but kept generating this support system. And we saw that parallel in his life. So that's when neuroscience comes in art-based therapy. That when we look at the neuroscientific impact, it says that basically how we function is we have a left and a right brain, correct? And we know that creativity is actually one of the few characteristics that kind of encompasses both sides. So it triggers or wakes up both sides of the brain. And that's the balance or the kind of bridge between looking at the more cognitive, structured, linguistic aspect of ourselves and the more image-based characteristics of ourselves. And I've digressed, but how I started was talking about answering, I think, Sameer's question, where I had begun to say that there are some areas where it's extremely effective. So for example, trauma work, right? So I have another example of a study we are working on not the obsessions and compulsions, but on reintegration, which is how does he get back to a life which he's lost, where social relationships have been impacted, interactions, confidence has been impacted. That's when I started bringing in art-based interventions, and the interventions were more around poetry, around me reading poetry or sharing poetry with him, which I felt might connect to. Then him bringing back music that he connected, and that was a real shift in therapy. Because when that started coming in, he started feeling less alone, less isolated, more like someone truly understood how he felt. Because we moved away from focusing on obsessions, compulsions. That's something that had settled with medication and the CBT work that we were doing. But that's when art therapy really came in, when the goal became interpersonal, when the goal became around confidence, around self. And that's where it made a difference. But we weren't drawing, we weren't coloring. We were using poetry, we were using narrative, we were using metaphor, and a little bit of writing that he began to do, and that was extremely powerful and sort of sustained his journey as he progressed moving forward. So I think it completely varies. So well, okay. And yeah, again, I mean, in general, I was saying, and I think it's important because I think this seminar is about psychology and understanding different fields. But I think since all of you are, or majority of you would be students, I think it's important to recognize that no one form of therapy works for everybody. And that's why I think the seminar is really brilliant, because it's good to learn about different formats and see what works for you, what you're drawn to as a therapist and as a client, right? Because that also might be different. So I think it's really interesting that when work comes to me, someone comes in and let's say someone comes in with a certain issue and I feel someone else is better suited in my team or an external reference to deal with that, I will refer out. And I will say that, okay, I think you need to contact so-and-so person, they might be more effective in doing family work with you or working with your father because, so on and so forth. This is the struggle. This person is more sort of trained in this field. So I feel like if we start looking at that this could work for somebody, and if it doesn't work for somebody, we don't have to shove it down their throat. That it's okay that different things will work for different people, right? Okay. So now comes the big question of interpretation. So I think this is what excites people the most around art therapy. And now this is visual art therapy, right? Because it's hard to interpret movement. Though we actually have an interpretation framework, interestingly, for movement, an assessment framework. But when you look at visual art therapy, the core answer is we do not interpret. The burden of interpretation lies on the client, which means your job is to utilize Socratic questioning, building a certain art framework where the person is able to reflect and share what has come up in their art and discover. You can make broad assumptions once you've known the person, you've gotten to really know them. But that's why also when you look at projective tests or techniques, they're not used on their own. Right? We utilize them in a battery of tests or in collaboration of a range of different tests together. So I think that remember this, that we're not saying, oh, this person has used black, so they must be sad. No. Black can mean 100 different things for 100 different people. So can a certain kind of structure or a face or anything. But what we look at is broad things. So let's say something hidden is something overlapping. Who do they identify with as the self character? Who do they identify with as the other? Are the parents coming in? Is the family structure beginning to come in? So there's specific assessment tools that we do use, but we don't sort of judge that. You then help, part of the assessment or intervention is to help the person verbalize what's come up. You have to be able to train to direct conversation. Actually, I wish if this was a smaller seminar, perhaps I would have actually got you guys to do a little bit of artwork. If some of you are game for that, and oh no, but we won't have enough time. Maybe some other time, I'll actually get you to do a little quick piece of artwork. And if those of you who are interested, we actually do these Instagram lives every single day where we've been doing art therapy sessions for people to try out on a regular basis. I think since the lockdown started, so we must have done about 600 lives now. So that you actually get a sense of what art and well-being and art therapy can work like for you. What are the qualities required to be an art therapist? So the qualities essentially are an interest. I mean, like in any other field of psychotherapy, you have to be interested. You have to go through a lot of vigorous training and also a lot of different art processes. So I'm trained in movement therapy, I'm trained in visual art therapy, and writing narratives in the art space, right? Before which, of course, I had trained in trauma work, in CBT, working with children and marriage and family. So you have to have an interest. You have to study really, really hard. And that's it. You don't have to be good. I'm a horrible artist. So if I start showing you my artwork, you'll be like, what? So you're not supposed to be good. The idea with art therapy is to be able to utilize the medium comfortably and effectively. So in our training, I think in movement and my visual art both, for 2 years I was grilled on just being able to get comfortable with the medium and not panicking and not worrying about making it perfect. You see, that is also where our projections come in. If I ask you right now to pick up a sheet of paper and draw whatever comes into your head, 50% of you will get stuck saying, no, but what should we draw? Okay, what do you want us to do? Should we draw a picture? Should we draw something still life? Should we draw a view? Should I draw how I feel? So a lot of your process is what color you pick up, what medium you pick up, how careful are you, how worried about presentation. All those things will be reflective of who you are as a person. And that's the brilliant part about art therapy, that process of the magic. Content is only part of your interpretation or your understanding. The process of how the person does it, where they get stuck while they're drawing, where they pull back, where they erase, where they don't erase. I don't even keep an eraser in my sessions mostly unless someone asks for it specifically. Vikasha is really yeah. I was thrown out of art class when I was in class 7. And I really enjoyed art, and I didn't realize I really enjoyed art till recently again. But yeah, I was kicked out of art class, and the teacher said you're not good enough, so you can't even take it as a. This was SUPW in school. We used to have something called, which is like the recreation. I was kicked out of recreational art class, and that's really unfortunate. And that I think takes me back to looking at creativity. How many of you? I'm going to ask a question are have climbed a tree, fallen off, been really creative with the games you play. You have stories you've heard from your parents and your grandparents around this is what we used to do, this is what we did, this is, we used to climb these trees, हमने ये करा है, we broke a bat and then started using something else to come up with another game. How many of you have colored really freely or played really freely without worrying too much? And you'll find that the answer might be yes, but it could have deteriorated over time. And you're very lucky if it has. But I think I'm seeing it with young children even today when you go to schools, right? That creativity isn't allowed. So when you draw a tree, if you draw a tree with me, this is how we draw a tree. You draw birds like this. So now birds don't look like that, and trees definitely don't look like that, right? So I think this structured understanding of creativity actually takes away a lot of our life skills because our ability to problem solve diminishes. What does creativity offer us? It offers us choice, it offers us exploration, it actually develops brain structures to be able to make decisions for memory, for attention, for concentration, for attention, for also looking at it's basically your core executive function for those of you who have studied executive functions of the brain. Two, when we reduce that, what do? We're telling children or adults that ek rasta hai. There's one way to look at things. Therefore, when you get to school later, when you start working or you go to college, your brain is always looking for what's that one way. What's that one answer to this question? What's that one way to draw something the right way, the perfect way, the good way? And a lot of anxiety related issues, disorders, struggles that are coming up today are related to this concept of this self created need or society created or parental or whatever it is, pressure for perfection. And when asked to understand perfection, we're just like, I don't even know. Where is it and what is perfect? Right? Nothing. There is no perfect. So I think somewhere what we kind of try to bring back as a core, which is what was discovered when they stumbled upon art therapy, was that it's not about perfection. How do we break people out of that structure? How do we create creativity again? How do we give freedom for creative spaces to adults, children, whoever is struggling? And that becomes a healing process. And we've actually done neuroscientific research where they have tested, I mean, you can actually see brain structures out, which is really, really fascinating, right? And there's a whole model called the ETC, the Expressive Therapies Continuum, based on neuroscientific evidence, which talks about what mediums to use. So with a certain kind of person who's struggling with, who's more structured, who's more cognitive, who's really, really like clear that, we'll cross-question you 3,000 times before say, let's do artwork. What framework would I use? Paint because it's a more fluid medium? Would I use movement again because I would break them away from language and visuals? Versus someone who's extremely emotional, I would not use fluid because the expressive therapy continuum teaches us that if I actually use more structured media or collage, I'll help them contain their emotions. Right? So there's a lot, and there are lots and lots and lots of little pieces to this. Okay, we have another thought. Could you send across the Instagram link or the page? Yes, I will share that on the chat if that works for you guys. I'm sharing mine and the fourth is and so when I'm doing my lives, you'll see it posted on mine as functional part. She wrote, which is cut out best friend ko boyfriend se bachaya, which means she saved her best friend from making a bad decision about a guy. अच्छी सुंदर आँखें, good at talking, so बातचीत. Then some other things around how she liked her hair and so on and so forth. And I think what happened when she filled this out, she looked at it and she smiled and she said, "Oh, I didn't realize that there would be so many positives that would." Would come up. some extreme trauma or struggles in our lives, we start thinking like, okay, oh, it's so annoying, it's so bad, everything is so problematic. Our negative narrative, our problem story, as they call it in narrative therapy, develops very clearly. Our exception story, what are the strengths, what are the solutions, what are the gaps, things we've achieved or succeeded in previously, it doesn't form as easily. So as a therapist, the job becomes to then facilitate the formation of the exception story, right? So even if it was just these two little green hands and one head, this was our breakthrough session where then she began agreeing for physio because she suddenly wanted to draw. So she started doing physio for her hands. And then progressively actually started working on her body and started getting the treatment she needed, taking the medication. Just a couple of other examples. This one is an outpatient. Now, this is an actual therapy session with a teenager who came in when she was younger, who was actually traumatized and had gone through sexual physical trauma in a hospital setting, which we did not find out about till about 6 months after she came to me. She came to me 2 years after 2 years of going to a psychiatrist plus cognitive behavior therapist. Then she switched to a psychoanalyst. So there had been all this happening in her journey ever since she was 12. I think she came to me when she was 14, finally. Now, she had developed somatic symptoms, which means you can see the little wheelchair on the side. She was actually constantly on a wheelchair. She couldn't talk. She wouldn't make eye contact. She said her knees didn't work. They were in pain. And there was a range of sessions we went through, which were basically initially focused around strength. And you know how it started. I remember my first therapy session is she came in, and this is after history taking with the family, so on and so forth. She came in and they rolled her in on a wheelchair and we both sat, and she wasn't talking, she wasn't making eye contact. I had just got 2 sheets of paper, I had got all the material lying there. And I started drawing. So I took a sketch pen and I started drawing, and I'm not good. I told you guys I'm a bad artist. So I was just verbalizing to her. It's another different technique of verbalization. As I was drawing, I kept telling her what I'm drawing. I said, you know what, this is all the stuff that I love, and I can't think of anything else, so I'm just drawing that for now. And I was trying to draw a chocolate. So it looked like a brown blob. And the first words she said to me were, I think, 45 minutes into the session, when I drew that brown blob, and she looked and she said, oh, aapko doggies achhe lagte hain? Do you like dogs? And in my head, and I was very young, I had just started out my own therapeutic practice. So I was so excited in my head. I was like, oh my God, she's finally said a word after 45 minutes in a session. And I had to restrain myself from turning around and saying, "Tumne baat kari," you said a word. And I think I kept going. I said, "Arey nahi, I'm actually drawing a chocolate, and I'm scared of dogs." And at that point I was. But I said, "Do you like dogs?" And she again shut down. And then I kept drawing. And then I told her a story about how I used to have a dog when I was younger, so on and so forth. And then at the end of the session, she just took a sketch pen and she drew one dog on that sheet of paper, and that's it. She left. She didn't even take it. As the sessions progressed, she began to draw. She didn't talk. She began drawing her dogs. She began drawing music she liked. I listened to a lot of Taylor Swift in that phase and One Direction, which were her favorite then. So we'd have a lot of music in sessions. She began verbalizing after, I think, 3-4 sessions, where she really started talking about her artwork. She started talking about how she felt. As we progressed in therapy, now this image is from about 7 months into therapy. Now this is a teenager, right? And what we did was, this was a directive which was an unstructured directive. When you look at the EPC, to move away from cognitive symbolic to an affective level, emotions. That's why I used art. Now this is art caring. This is where I used paint, right, which is fluid medium. So here what I did is I just asked her, I said, can we separate colors that you feel you like when you're not feeling great, which scare you, which annoy you, which frustrate you, and also colors which make you feel good, positive, etc. So she separated 2 sets of colors. When we picked the first set, I said, let's just create something. I was sitting on the other side. And she began to kind of move. She used red, she used black, she used these cotton things for eyes, there was browns, there was greens. You can't see because eventually it became a mush. And on the side, she's written little notes of who these people were. And this is the first time she actually shared what had happened, and the parents went and filed a case and so on and so forth. Till now, I think 2.5 years into the experience she had, she had not been able to even share that this has happened to her, what exactly had happened. They knew something had happened. They thought it was threatening and abuse, but they didn't realize sexual violence had also taken place. This is much later, fast forward 2 years into therapy. So this was long-term work where we were looking at, again, reintegration. This was an art activity around boundary building, where we were drawing, the directive I gave her was, okay, let's draw a castle. And let's say that, you're in this castle somewhere. Where would everyone else be? And what would be your safeguards, right? So that allows us to project how many safeguards. So if you see, look at the safeguards, right? There'll be lions, tigers. There's almost roots growing out of the castle. There's, I remember these two poles were ice and fire. So there's dry ice, if you touch it, you get burnt. There's fire pole. And she's locked away in one far away room. Her dog is inside with her. I am at the gate. Her parents are, I think, also at the gate. Then there's a fence, then one or two friends. So we got to know a lot about where she was at. She got to know a lot about where she was at. The capes, this is when we started doing movement-based work, where she gave up one of her favorite things, which was like her superhero strength space. So it's almost like the technique of positive self-talk, but using artwork. And, we do a lot of movement-based interventions by this point. She had moved past a lot of her somatic symptoms of not being able to move. So, she's sitting in a place where she's had to go up and down, walk around. We'd also have performance concerts around Taylor Swift. So that's just an example of more in-depth, long-term work with a teenager. This you can see are adults, young adults in space. These are examples through art. This is an example of a movement-based intervention that I was doing with the group. And this is just actually a picture from our course where we train people in art-based therapy, which, as someone read out my profile, said UNESCO and CID certification. So that's a course we actually started teaching because we realized such a lack of art therapists. But if you look at the image on the right also, you can see how telling the image is. Now, you don't have to be a great artist to draw this. Can you see what the person has drawn? It's not about being a fabulous artist. It's about being able to understand, allow, reflect, in the presence of someone who's trained, who can build a safe space, who can direct the process for you over time based on the goals that you're struggling with. Okay. I'm coming back to the screen. And I have lost it. I have some questions. Do I? One question. Okay. Any other questions? You can also add on now that we've closed that. Any questions about the case, about anything in general? You can pause me. Working as a counselor, do we need to train in different forms of expressive arts? So when you do a course in art-based therapy, in whichever different form, if you do it in expressive arts, they might cover multiple modalities. If you do specific form training, they will. So the idea is they will train you to get comfortable using different modalities. They won't teach you to be good at it, right? So I'm comfortable using clay and paint and different kinds of paint, and I understand how they work. So when you're training to be a practitioner, I need to know the difference between how acrylic paint will work versus how poster paint will work, for example, or how wax crayons will be different from oil pastels. And can I use the wax crayons to go over other crayons and use that as a technique when I'm scraping? So I need to know my art forms, right? Or I need to know what kind of a canvas so that I can use watercolor sheets and pour watercolor and move it around, or what goes with it. So the more you utilize your medium, right? Whether if it's verbalization is your medium, then the more you talk, the more you write, the more you read, the better you'll be. The more you draw, the more you color, the more you play with different mediums, the more you move, the more you dance, the more you'll be able to facilitate comfort for another person with full knowledge of what all you can use. Otherwise, you'll be distracted. Does that make sense? Awesome. Any other questions for anybody? Now the floor is open for questions, for thoughts that you might have. I think unfortunately movement I can't show you, but it's again such a powerful, that was the first thing I was introduced to, was an organization in Bombay that came and did a workshop with me when I was at university. And they were from Kolkata. And they worked with women who had been trafficked, and they only used movement therapy. And they all spoke only Bengali, and we spoke Hindi, English, etc., whatever other languages that we were all from different parts of the country. And they did not have to communicate with us for 2 days. That's how powerful the movement process, the movement metaphors they took us through. So utilizing your body as literally the paintbrush was what happened in those 2 days in terms of expression and healing. And it was like by that time I was convinced that I had, I was like, I know everything. I've studied all these forms, and I've worked through my own struggles, and I've been in for therapy, and I've done all the things I need to do. And 2 days of movement therapy just kind of broke my whole sense of what it means to have actually worked on themselves. And I think I then stopped that organization for 6 months saying, do you have an internship? Do you have an internship? Do you have a training course? Please train me. And that time there was nothing there. So I think, it's quite an interesting journey. I was in this about over 11 years ago. So I have no idea what it's like now. We used to be a class of 17, 18, 16 to 18 people. And now it's become a whole other ball game. So honestly, it's not about where you go. You study hard for whatever it is that you want to do. You try your best to learn. You get as much experience as you possibly can. I know it's difficult during COVID, but the more you push yourself, the more you are able to get experience, whether it's internships, observations, workshops, seminars, the more you grow. And the more you read, the more you grow. There's so many resources available. There's so many videos available. So the more you do that, I think you will be more effective. And wherever you go. I think now if you realize with people working in different areas, it doesn't really matter whether you go to X college or Y college. There are people from everywhere doing everything and doing really well. I think it depends more on how you are. Because when we interview people, we're really not hiring based on where they study. We're looking at the person and we're like, okay, does this person know what they're talking about? Do they have their content? What are they able to communicate effectively? So what are those skills as a psychologist, psychotherapist, art-based and or not? What do you know? Time duration of the course at Fortis, typically this year we couldn't do it thanks to the pandemic, and we didn't want to go online because that would dilute a lot of what we were trying to give you. It was a month and 2 weeks over the summer, because it's 3 to 4 days that you have to come and attend full days, and then there is assignments, so on and so forth. So it's been done over like a summer month period or month and a half period broadly. So I think it's going to be similar, and I think it's going to happen again in the coming summer, hopefully. Renuka, you can anyway write into us or DM us, and we'll share the link with any of you who want to apply. Though we're not accepting any applications right now, I mean the applications are all coming in, but we're waiting to figure out when life is going to go back to a place where we can actually come in person and do something. Oh yes, thank you so much. I would have just forgotten about my virtual art therapy. Lovely. I'm just going to open the PPT for that. Do I have time? Yes, I do. Thought of becoming an art therapist? One needed to be good at art? No. Again, I will say it for anyone who's just logged in. To be an art therapist, you do not need to be good at an art form. You need to be exposed to different kinds of art forms that you would like to practice, whether it's visual, movement, writing, whatever. So you need to be comfortable using the art form. You do not need to be good at it. And I promise you. Now I'm going to quickly show you a little bit of virtual art therapy. So what we've been doing, going virtual, is using Zoom. Zoom has some fabulous options to create art online, including the whiteboard. And if we were on Zoom, I would have done it with you folks right now. But that's been one of my key discoveries, which actually, I think it was a 17-year-old client that I was working with showed me the first time. And it has just, I'm going to show you one client's artwork that I have got consent to show, where I have almost exclusively worked with this person through this period on Zoom. There's someone struggling with anxiety who just trying to look for the PPT that I hope I have somewhere. Aha. Oh yeah. So what we've been doing virtually is a combination of using virtual tools and or like what we're doing right now, but we have video on and we're actually, utilizing a space where art can be created. And the thing I find interesting about virtual art therapy is that if I create art, when I'm creating together and a screen is up in the center, there's a whole other experience. I can actually watch the person creating, struggling, placing. They can create multiple forms of art very quickly. So this example, I don't know if you can see my screen just yet. Hold on. Can you see it now? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Now this is it. I'm just going to rush through the different kinds of artwork that are there and you can have a glimpse. Now, it started off like this, right? I'm just going to breeze through. But you can see now the comfort with the new media also growing, right? And this was different things. You're struggling with a lot of bullying, with a lot of violence in the home, with a lot of anxiety that had been building up, feelings of isolation. Began at some point. Different characters were introduced. So the more adept she kept getting with it, the more you can see her play with it, and the different characters are actually mustard and ketchup for those two. Now these were all representations. Now this is a very verbal 17-year-old, right? This was a reflection of her parents. This was very interesting. So a lot of times in art therapy, we also talk about the gaps, what's not there. When someone who's making art which is so full suddenly goes to a point where suddenly it's like the whole session was just this. What happened? And I won't have enough time to get into it, but I'm just going to leave you with some of the images of just the interesting layering that I've learned that can happen virtually, which sometimes doesn't happen physically. Like you can't do it in physical art, and it's so powerful. So I remember this piece also. Just watching her go arrow, 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 arrow. It was almost like a combination of a movement and an art piece. And just like attacking this circle with this word that was Dil, or sorry, I think this was Dil written on it. And what this meant for her, and what that difficult relationship with the family or the parents or all her interpersonal relationships, what was that pointing towards? So can you see the kind of, and imagine, it's very hard to explain because in session it's very different to experience it. It's a different view, literally, when I'm watching someone create art or I'm creating with them versus when it's on the screen and it's growing with me. It's been very, very fascinating to see how it's converted. This was at a point where they discovered that you could import pictures and then create artwork on the pictures. Right? And this is, again, you can see a lot of different graphic trauma narratives coming in from how she felt or what she was feeling. And as an art therapist, it's important to also remember that symbols will be there to provoke you. There's a lot of transference, counter-transference that came up with this client specifically. I'm still working with her, though now we've reduced sessions over time. This is not all of the work, but look at this. Pop culture references are coming in much easier. So while in person I would have to collage, I would have to have material. Now on a virtual session, she could go online, pull up a picture of Justin Bieber and create this thing that she wanted to create out of. You can see the violence, you can see the pain. Now you can see the shift again. Can you see? Suddenly there's a shift in narrative. It's into Korean pop.